Little Princess of Tower Hill, Chapter 3, Snubbed. When the children met next, it was at tea-time. There was a very nice and tempting tea prepared in Maggie's schoolroom, and Miss Grey presided and took good care to attend to the wants of the hungry little traveller. Ralph looked a very different boy, sitting at the tea-table, munching bread and butter, and disposing of large plates of strawberries and cream, from what he did when Maggie met him at Ashbournham station. He was no longer in the least excited. He was neatly dressed, with his hair well brushed, and his hands extremely clean and gentlemanly. He was polite and attentive to Miss Grey, and thanked her in a quiet, sweet voice for the little attentions which she lavished upon him. Maggie was far too excited to feel hungry. She could scarcely take her round blue eyes off Ralph, who, for his part, did not pay her the smallest attention. He was conversing in a quiet and proper grown-up tone with his governess. "Do you really like flat countries best?" he said. "Ah, I suppose then you must suffer from palpitation. Mother does very much. She finds sal volatile does her good. Did you ever try that? When I next write to Mother, I shall ask her to send me a little bottle, and when you feel an attack coming on, I'll measure some drops for you. If you take 10 drops in a little water and then lie down, you don't know how much better you'll get." "Thank you, yes. I'll have another cup of tea. I like a good deal of cream, please, and 4 or 5 lumps of sugar, if the lumps are small. I don't mind having 6. Well, what were we talking about? Oh, scenery. I like hilly scenery. I like to get on the top of the hill and race down as fast as ever I can to the bottom. Sometimes I shout as I go. It's awfully nice shouting out loud as you're racing through the air. Did you ever try that? Oh, I forgot. You couldn't if you suffer from palpitation. I like steep mountains and flying over big precipices," here burst from Maggie. "I hate flat countries, and I don't think much of running down little hills. Give me the mountains and the precipices, and you'll see how I scamper." Ralph raised his eyebrows a tiny bit, smiled at Maggie with a gentle pity in his face, and then, without vouchsafing any comment to her audacious observations, resumed his placid conversation with the governess. "Mother and I have been a good deal in Switzerland, you know," he commented, "so of course we can really judge what scenery is like. I got tired of those great mountains after a bit. I'm very fond indeed of England, particularly since I have spent so much of my time with Joe. Do you know my little friend Joe, Miss Grey?" "No, Mr. Ralph, I cannot say I do. Is he a nice little boy? Is he about your age?" Ralph laughed, but in a very moderate way. "I beg your pardon," he exclaimed. "I hope you were not hurt when I laughed. Mother says it's very rude to laugh at a grown-up lady, but it seemed so funny to hear you speak of Joe as a boy. She's a girl, quite a very nice girl in the whole world, and her real name is Joanna, but I call her Joe." Here Maggie, who after Ralph's ignoring of her last audacious observation had been getting through her tea in a subdued manner, brightened up considerably, shook back her shining curls, and said in a much more gentle voice than she had hitherto used, "I should like to see her." "You?" said Ralph. "She's not the least in your style. Well, I've done my tea. Have you done your tea, Miss Grey? And may I leave the table, please? I should like to have a run round the place before it gets dark." "And may I come with you?" asked Maggie. "Oh, yes, Mag. Come along." Ralph held out his hand, which Maggie took with a great deal of gratitude in her heart, and the 2 children went out together into the sweet summer air. Ralph first of all inspected his pigeons, and then his rabbits. He grumbled a good deal over the arrangements made for the reception of his pets, and informed Maggie that the hutch for the rabbits was but small and close, and that the dovecots must be altered immediately, and that he would take care to speak to Uncle John about it in the morning. Maggie agreed with every word Ralph said. She, too, pronounced the hutch small and dirty, and said the dovecot must be altered. and while she echoed her cousin's sentiments, she felt herself quite big and important, and turned away from the rather smiling eyes of Jim, the stable boy, who was in attendance to the pair. The children, when proceeding to the stable, were where Maggie's pretty snow-white pony was kept. "Ah," said Ralph, "I wish you could see my horse. My horse is black and rather bigger than this, and he has an eye of fire, and such a beautiful glossy arched neck. I can tell you it's worth something to see Raven. Yes, Maggie, Snowball is rather a nice little pony, and very well suited for you, I should imagine." "I don't like him much," said Maggie, who until this moment had adored her pet. "I like flashy, frisky horses. I like them fresh, don't you, Ralph?" "Don't talk nonsense," said Ralph, rather pertly. "Now, where shall we go?" "Oh, Ralph, I should like to show you my garden. I dare say Father will give you a little garden near mine, if you ask him. I'm building a rockery. I don't work in my garden very often, 'cause it's rather tiresome, but I like building my rockery. And when we go to the seaside, I shall gather lots of shells for it. Come, Ralph, this is the way." "Never mind tonight," said Ralph. "Here is a nice seat on this little mossy bank. If you like to sit by me, Maggie, we can talk." Maggie was only too pleased. Ralph stretched himself on the soft, velvety grass, put his hands under his head, and gazed up at the sky. Maggie took to imitating his position in all particulars. She also put her hands under her head and gazed through her shady hat up at the tall trees where the rocks were going to sleep. That night the rather spoiled little princess of Tower Hill lay awake for some time. It was very unusual for Maggie to remain for an instant out of the land of dreams. The moment she laid her curly head on the pillow, she entered that pleasant country, and as a result she stayed there, and enjoyed delightful times with her dream children until the morning. On the present occasion, however, sleep did not visit her so quickly. She was disturbed by the events of the day. Ralph was a very new experience in her little life. She thought of all he had said to her, of how he had looked, of his extreme manliness, and his fearlessness, and his great politeness to Miss Grey. Maggie owned with a half sigh that there was nothing at all particularly gracious in Ralph's manner to her. "But I like him all the better for that," she thought. "How I do wish my pony was black, like Raven. I think I'll ask Father to sell Snowball. He's rather fat, stupid little horse. Ralph's horse has eyes of fire. How splendid he must be. I wonder if Joe has got a horse too, and if it's black, and if its eyes flash. Joe must be a splendid girl. Ralph talks of her as if she is a very good friend. I dare say she could climb trees and fish and shoot. I should like Ralph to talk of me as he talks of Joe." At this stage of Maggie's meditations her bright eyes closed very gently, and she remembered nothing more until the morning, when she woke, and she had been dreaming about Joe. She sprang up instantly and began to dress herself. This feat she had never accomplished before in her life. 2 servants, as a rule, waited on the little princess when she made her toilette. But now, with a vivid dream of the namely Joe in her mind, and with some vague ideas that she would please Ralph if she were up very bright and early, she proceeded to tumble into her cold bath, and then, after an untidy fashion, to scramble into her clothes. At last her dressing was complete, and she knelt down for a moment by her bedside to utter a very hasty little childish prayer, and then ran softly out of her bedroom. She certainly did not know how early it was, but as there was no one stirring in the house, and as she did not wish nurse to find her to call her back, and perhaps pop her once more into bed, she went on tiptoe along the passageway until she reached her cousin Ralph's bedroom door. She opened the door and went in. The large window of Ralph's bedroom exactly faced his little white bed. The blind of the window was up to the top, and the full light of the morning shone directly on the little sleeper's face. "Oh, how delightful!" thought Maggie. Ralph was still asleep, sound asleep. She was the good one now, for Ralph was decidedly lazy. She went softly to the bedside and gazed at her cousin. His arms were thrown up over his head. He was lying on his back and breathing softly and easily. Ralph had a handsome little face, and it looked gently and sweet in his slumber. The dauntless expression of his dark eyes and somewhat scornful and hard way in which he looked when he addressed himself to Maggie were no longer perceptible. Maggie had a loving little heart, and it went out to her strange cousin. "I hope some day he'll like me as well as he does Joe," she murmured. "Bother those flies," muttered Ralph, raising his head to brush at them. This remark caused Maggie to burst into a peal of laughter. Of course, her laugh aroused the young sleeper. "Yes, I'm up," said Maggie, dancing softly up and down. "I'm up, and I'm dressed, and I'm ready to go into the garden. Don't you think it's very good of me to get up so early? Don't you think I'm as good as Joe?" Ralph had recovered from his first surprise, and now he gazed tranquilly at his little cousin. "What's the hour?" he asked. Maggie said, "I don't know." "Well, you'd better find out," responded Ralph. "It feels very early. My watch is on the dressing-table." "Do you know the time by a watch yet? If you can read it, you may, and tell me the hour. How untidily you have dressed yourself." Maggie felt herself growing very red when Ralph asked her if she could tell the hour by the watch. The fact was she could not. She had always been too lazy to learn. She went in a faltering way to the dressing-table, feeling quite sure in her little heart that Joe knew all about watches, and that if she revealed her ignorance to Ralph, he would despise her for the rest of her life. Just at this moment, however, relief came, for the stable clock was heard to strike very distinctly. It struck 4 times. "It's 4 o'clock," said Maggie. "Yes, and what a muff you are," answered Ralph. 4 o'clock! Why, it's the middle of the night. Good night, Maggie. Please go away and shut the door after you." "Then you're not getting up?" questioned the little cousin wistfully. "Getting up? No, thank you. Not for many an hour to come. Good night, Maggie. I don't want to be rude, but you really are a little worried coming in and waking me in this fashion." Chapter 4. The Stable Clock. It was rather desolate standing at the other side of Ralph's door in the passage. There was plenty of light in the passage, but no sunshine, and Maggie felt her excitement cooling down and her heart beating tranquilly again. All that delightful energy and zest which she had shown when dressing herself, which she had felt when she had danced into her cousin's room, had forsaken her. She walked slowly back to her own little chamber, wondering what she had better do now, and thinking how very disagreeable it was to be spoken in such a fashion as a muff. Was it really only the middle of the night, and had she better just ignominiously undress herself and go back to bed? No, she would not do that. It was horrid to think of Ralph sound and happy asleep, and of nurse asleep and father and mother also in their land of dreams. Maggie felt quite forlorn, and as if she were alone in the world. But at this moment a thrush perched itself on a bough of clematis just outside the window, and sang a delicious morning song. The little princess clapped her hands. "The birdies are up," she exclaimed. "I expect lots of delightful creatures are up in the garden. I'll go into the garden. Perhaps, after all, Ralph is more of a muff than I am." She swung her garden hat on her head and ran softly and quickly downstairs. All the doors were barred and locked. The place felt intensely still and strange, but Maggie found egress through a small side window, which she easily opened, and once in the garden, her loneliness and sadness vanished like magic. She laughed aloud and ran happily hither and thither. The butterflies were out, and the birds were having a splendid morning concert, and the flowers were opening their petals and taking their morning breakfast from the sunshine. "Oh dear, Ralph is the muff, and I am the good one after all," exclaimed Maggie aloud. She ran until she was tired, and then went into the arbor at one end of the long grass walk, and sat down to rest herself. In a moment the most likely thing happened. She fell asleep. She slept in the arbor with her head resting on the rustic table until the stable clock struck 6. That sound awoke her, and she rubbed her drowsy eyes and looked round. Jim, the boy who had smiled the night before, when he saw Maggie and Ralph talking together, passed the entrance to the little arbor at this moment, with a bag of tools slung over his shoulder. Maggie called to him. "Jim, come here. Aren't you surprised I'm up to see you?" "Why, Miss Maggie," exclaimed the astonished stable boy, "you a-sittin' in the arbor at this hour, miss? Oh dear, ain't you very cold, miss? And was you overtook with sleep? And did you spend the night here? Why, I 'spect your poor pa and ma are fine affright about you." Miss Maggie. "Oh no, they're not," answered Maggie, shaking herself, and running up to Jim and taking hold of one of his hands. "They know nothing at all about it, Jim. They are all in their beds, every one of them sound fast asleep. Even my new cousin Ralph is asleep. He said I'm a muff, but I expect he is. Isn't it luscious being up so bright and early, Jim?" "Well, no, missus, I don't think it is. I likes to lie in bed uncommon myself, so I do, and I ates getting up of a morning, Miss Maggie, and whenever I gets a holiday, don't I take it out in my bed, that's all." "Oh, you poor Jim," said Maggie in a very compassionate tone. "I didn't know bed was thought such a treat. I don't find it so. Well, Jim, I'm glad, however, you're obliged to be up this morning, 'cause you and me we can be company to one another. I'm going with you into the stable yard now." "Oh, but missus, I has to clean out Snowball's stable and get another stable ready for Master Ralph's pony Raven, and that's all work that a little lady could have no call to mix with. I think, missy, if I was you, I'd go straight back to my bed and have another hour or two asleep before Sir John and her ladyship are up." But Maggie shook her head very decidedly over this proposition. "No," she said, "I'm going to the stable yard. I'm going to look at Snowball, and I don't think very much of Snowball. I think he'll have to be sold." Jim opened his eyes and raised his eyebrows a trifle at this proof of inconsistency on Maggie's part, for he thought fit to offer her verbal objections, and the two walked together in the direction of the stables. Here the large stable clock attracted the erratic little mind's attention. She suddenly remembered the dreadful feeling of shame which had swept over her when Ralph had asked her to tell him the hour. She had earnestly wished all that moment that she had been a good child and had learned how to tell the time when Miss Grey offered to teach her. It would never do for Ralph to discover her deficiency in this matter. Perhaps Jim could teach her. She turned to him eagerly. "Jim, do you know how to tell a clock's time?" "Yes, missus, of course. It's 6:15. "Oh, how clever you are, Jim, to tell me that. Do you find it out by looking up at the stable clock?" "Why, of course, Miss Maggie. There it is in front of us. You can see for yourself." Maggie's face became very grave, and her eyes assumed quite a sad expression. "I want to whisper something to you, Jem," she said. "Stoop down, and I want to say it very, very low. I don't know the clock time." Jim received this solemn secret in a grave manner. He was silent for a moment, and then he said slowly, "You can learn it, I suppose, Miss Maggie?" Oh, yes, dear Jim, you can teach me. Jim began to rumple up his hair and to look perplexed. Oh, I? Oh, that's another thing, he said. Yes, you can, Jim. You must begin right away. There's a big, round, white thing, and there are little figures marked on it, and there are two hands that move 'cause I've watched them, and there's a funny thing at the bottom that goes tick-tick all the time. That's the pendulum, Miss Maggie. Yes, the pendulum, repeated Maggie. I'll remember that word. I won't forget. Now, go on, Jim. What's the next thing? Well, there's the two ends, miss. The little end points to the hours, and the big end to the minutes. It sounds very puzzling, said Maggie. So it is, miss, so it is. You couldn't learn the clock, not for a score o' days. It took a week o' Sundays over it myself, and I'm not to say dull. The clock's a puzzler, Miss Maggie, and can't be learned off in a jiffy anyhow. Well, but, Jim, Ralph mustn't find out. He mustn't ever find out that I don't know how to tell time. It would be quite dreadful that Ralph would think of me then. He wouldn't ever believe that I could turn out as well as his friend Joe. You don't think Jo such a wonderful girl, do you, Jim? Oh, no, Miss Maggie. I don't think nothing at all about her. I'd better get to my work now, miss. Yes, but you must teach me something about the old clock, just to make Ralph suppose I know about the hour. Well, miss, you can talk a little about the pendulum, and the big hand, and the little hand, and you can say that you think the stable clock is fast. It is that same, miss, and that will sound very cute. Now I must go to my sweeping. William will be round almost immediately, and he'll be ever so angry if I have nothing done. So you'll please to excuse me, miss. Maggie left the stable-yard rather discontentedly. It was not her 6:30, and breakfast would not be on the table for 2 long hours yet. What should she do? After all, perhaps she was a muff to get up in the middle of the night. Perhaps she was the silly one, and Ralph, so snug and rosy and comfortable in his new little bed, was the wise and good one. Some things very like tears came to Maggie's bright blue eyes as she turned back again to the garden, where she was beginning to feel a little tired. Oh, very hungry. She wondered if Joe ever got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and if Ralph had ever called Joe a muff. But of course he had not. Joe was doubtless one of those unpleasant model little girls about whom nurse sometimes spoke to her on Sunday. Little girls who always did at once what their old nurse told them, who never rumpled their pinafores, nor made their hair untidy, nor soiled their clean hands, but walked instead of running, and smiled instead of laughing. Nurse had spoken over and over of these little ladylike misses. These little girls delighted in doing plain needlework, and were intensely happy when they conquered a fresh word in their reading, and they always adored their governesses and were rather sorry when holiday time came. When nurses spoke about these children, Maggie usually interrupted her vehemently with the exclamation, "I hate those proper good little girls." And then nurse's small twinkling brown eyes would grow full of suppressed fun, and she would kiss her spoiled darling. Maggie, as she walked through the garden, where the dew was still sparkling, quite made up her mind that Jo belonged to this unpleasant order of little minds, and she determined to dislike her very much. As she was sauntering slowly along, she passed a small narrow path, which led into a shrubbery. Directly through the shrubbery was another path, which branched out into the direction of Maggie's neglected garden. Suppose she went and did a little weeding in her garden, or no, suppose she did what would be much more enchanting, suppose she paid a visit to Ralph's rabbits. Ralph had complained the night before of the hutch where his pets had been put. He had grumbled at its not being bright enough, and large enough, and clean enough. Suppose Maggie went and furbished it up a little, and looked at Ralph's pets and gave them some lettuce leaves to eat. In a moment she had flown through the shrubbery, had passed the little neglected garden and half-finished rockery, and was kneeling down by the hutch where Ralph's rabbits had made themselves a new home. There they were, two beautiful snow-white creatures, with long silky hair and funny bright red eyes and pink noses. They had not a black hair on either of their glossy coats. Ralph had said they were very valuable rabbits, and because of the extreme purity of their coats, he had called them Lily and Bianco. Maggie, too, thought them lovely. She bent close to the bars of the hutch and called them to her, and tried to stroke their noses through the little round holes. Bianco was very tame, but Lily was a little shy. She kept in the background and did not allow her nose to be rubbed. Maggie showered endearing names on her. No pet she had ever possessed herself seemed equal to Ralph's snow-white rabbits. After playing with them for a little, she ran into the kitchen garden to fetch some lettuce leaves, and with a good bundle in her arms, returned to the rabbit's hutch. At so tempting a sight, even Lily lost her shyness, and pressed her nose against the bars of her cage. "They shall come out and eat their breakfast in peace and comfort. You little darlings," exclaimed Maggie. "Here, I am making a nice pile of it just by this tree, and I'll open the door, and out they'll both come. While they were eating, I can be cleaning the hutch. What a nice, useful girl I'm going to be, after all. I expect Ralph will think I am quite as good as that stupid old Joe of his. Come along, Bianco, pet, here's your little breakfast ready for you. Oh, you darling, precious Lily, you need not be afraid of me. I would not hurt a hair of your lovely coat." Open went the door of the hutch, and out scrambled the two white rabbits. They bounded in rabbit fashion towards the green lettuce, and when Maggie saw them happily feeding, she turned her attention to the hutch. "No, this is not a proper hutch," she said to herself. "It's not large enough, nor roomy enough, nor handsome enough. I don't wonder at poor Ralph's being put out. He felt he was treated shabbily. I must speak to father about it. There must be a new hutch made as quickly as possible. Well, I had better clean this out while the dear bunnies are having their breakfast. I'll see if I can get some fresh straw. I'll run round to the yard and try if I can pull some straw out of one of the ricks. I really am most useful. Good-bye, Bianco and Lily. I'll be back with you in a moment, dear little pets." The rabbits did not pay the slightest heed to Maggie's loving words. It is to be feared that, beautiful as they were in person, they possessed but small and selfish natures. They liked fresh lettuce very much, and when they had eaten enough, they looked round somewhat shyly, after the manner of timid little creatures. The whole place represented a strange world to them, but as there was not a soul in sight, they thought they might explore this new land of little. Bianco bounded out in front and looked back at Lily. Lily scampered after her companion. In a short time they found themselves on the boundary of a green and shady and pleasant little wood. In this wood, doubtless, abounding those many good and tempting things to which rabbits, as a race, are partial. They went a little farther, and lost themselves in the soft green herbage. When Maggie returned to the rabbit hutch, with her arms full of straw and her rosy cheeks much flushed, Bianco and Lily were nowhere to be seen.